record. All my sessions are recording. Now, you can take that control panel and minimize it if you want. You see in the upper right where there's an X and there's two arrows next to it?
Yeah.
Click on the arrows.
Oh, all right.
That's a toggle switch.
Yeah.
Now, if you click on the arrows again, it opens it back up.
Yep.
And that gives you a little bit more space to see the screen. I always keep mine minimized. That way I have the full screen to work with. All right. So you said factoring. These are problems you can probably just verbalize. You don't need to take a picture of them and send them.
All right. Let me turn to the page in my textbook.
Okay.
275. Alrighty. Right. So the first problem on my page is x squared equals -13, and it's solving a quadratic equations.
Okay, that's fine.
Is what it said.
How do I solve?
Yeah. You have to get rid of the x squared.
How do I do that?
Divide it?
No.
No?
I can see why you'd want to divide that by x, because that would leave x. But then we would have an x on the other side. And you only solve an equation when you get the variable completely on one side and not on the other. So the way for me to do that is to take the square root of both sides. That leaves x on the left side. And whenever you solve an equation by taking the square root of both sides, the answer begins with the words plus or minus. Okay? Now, clearly you are into complex numbers, so you've had imaginary numbers. What is the square root of -13 equal to in terms of I?
It's like, I don't remember.
Here's how you do it. First of all, when I have the square root of two things that are multiplied together, I can separate them like this. Okay? So that's the first rule you need to know. Well, what that means up here is I can make that the square root of -1 times the square root of 13. In other words, -1 times 13 is -13. Well, the square root of -1 is the definition of I. So it's I times the square root of 13. We usually write the real part first, so I'm going to write that 13I, and it is plus or minus. So that's the answer right there. And the only thing to be careful of is don't put the I under the radical sign. Make sure that it's outside the radical sign.
All right.
Okay. What else do we got?
Okay. X squared plus 11 equals 3.
First step?
I'm trying to get the x on its own.
Yeah. Which means, let's first of all get the x squared on its own by moving that 11 to the other side. So that's the first step.
All right.
Now what?
We have to do the same thing as the first problem. So we would have to x squared equals -8 squared.
Well, hold on.
And then it would be...
hold on. Let's back up a second. It's not x squared equals -8 squared. It's the square root of x squared equals the square root of -8. Again, we're solving an equation by taking the square root of both sides. Always begin your answer with the words plus and minus. Always.
All right.
Okay. If I told you x squared was equal to 9, the answer is plus or minus 3. because I did this by
Okay.
taking the square root of both sides. So here,
Yeah.
the answer is the square root of negative 8. Now, 8, radical 8 can be simplified. In other words, that's equal to plus or minus the square root of minus 1 times the square root of 8. But
All right.
the square root of 8 equals the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. In other words, if there are two factors of 8, which one of is a perfect square number like 4, then that converts to that. So square root of 8 is actually simplifies to 2 root 2. And you always want to give that answer. You never want to give the unsimplified one.
All right.
So
That makes
this
sense.
total answer is plus or minus 2 root 2 I. Here's the I. There's the 2 root 2.
Okay.
You with me? Make sure
Yep.
that you follow everything I'm doing. Otherwise, stop and say, I don't understand. I'll back up and go over it again.
All right.
Okay. Are you, before we go to the next problem, I just want to test you a little bit. Simplify that.
Fifth.
So the goal is to find factors of 50. In other words, this would work. There's a problem with that, though. Neither one of these simplifies. So that's not the solution.
So would it be 2 and 25?
There, 25 is a perfect square number. That's what you're looking for. So that simplifies to that. Square root of 50 is equal to 5 root 2.
Okay.
Okay?
That makes sense.
All right. So let's go back to your problems. What's the next
one? X squared minus 8 equals negative 36.
So x squared equals negative 28, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now take me from there.
So
let's just do it step by step. Don't try to do 2 steps at once.
Okay, so you split the x. So x equals the square root of 1.
Split the x. Hold on a second. You don't split the x. You take the square root of both sides. In other words, I'm going to take the square root of the left side and I'm going to take the square root of the right side. That does basically split the x, but the reason I mention it is when you solve an equation by taking the square root of both sides, you have to begin your answer with the words plus and minus. So x is plus or minus the square root of negative 28. So that's the next line.
All right.
Now let's simplify that. Let's figure out what the square root of negative 28 is. Well, first of all, it's what? The square root of minus 1 times the square root of 28. Always do that. So that gives you I times the square root of 28. Well, are there any factors of 28 where one of the factors is a perfect square number?
I can only think of like...
Think of factors of 28. Here, I'll tell you what. Let me give you a little exercise. When you're factoring a number, over here on the left, start there. Those two multiply together to give 28, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now cut this one in half and double the other one. Those two multiply together to 28. Still don't have a perfect square number, but I can cut 14 in half one more time and double the other one. There you go. Those are the factors, and 4 is a perfect square number. So this becomes I times the square root of 4 times the square root of 7, which becomes I times 2 times root 7. And the best way to write that is 2 root 7 times I. And don't forget the plus or minus in front. So there's my answer. Plus or minus 2 root 7 I. It's a little odd. The final answer almost is in the exact opposite order of the way you end up doing it. I guess one thing I could do here is, hold on a second. My eraser's not working on this program. I don't know why. I won't bother. What do you got next?
So 3x squared minus 7 equals negative 31.
Okay, first step.
Add 7.
In fact, just read the next line to me. We're going to solve this equation line by line. Just read the next
line. So it'd be 23x squared equals negative 24.
Okay, next line.
And then would I divide by 3?
Yep.
Yeah.
In other words, you want to you got to get rid of everything associated with the x.
Yeah.
Okay? I had to get rid of the negative 7, so I added 7 to both sides. Now I got to get rid of the 3, which is a multiplier, so I'm going to divide both sides. I'm always doing the opposite of what that thing is doing. I was subtracting 7, therefore I added 7. I was multiplying by 3, therefore I'm dividing by 3. So now we get this. What's the next step or the next line?
We have to find the square root of both numbers.
Correct. Both sides.
Both sides, yeah.
And what did we begin our answer with?
X equals plus or minus 8 squared.
The square root of negative 8.
Negative 8.
In other words, here's what we're doing. We're taking the square root of that. We're taking the square root of that. Well, when you take the square root of x squared, you get x.
Yeah.
Okay. The only thing we have to add is the plus and minus because we're solving an equation by taking the square root of both sides. Now let's look at the minus 8. Well, that's clearly minus 1 times 8. But what about 8? Are there any factors of 8 where one of the factors is a perfect square?
Yeah, 4.
4 and 2. So now I'm here, up here in the upper right. Well, that's equal to I. That's equal to the number 2, and that's still square root of 2. So my answer is going to be what? Plus and minus what? How do I write that answer?
Hang on. Let me see the other. Is it equals I?
Put the I at the end. That's the only thing you have to do.
All right.
Don't put the I up front.
Okay, so then it would be 2 square root of 2i.
And just make sure that that I is outside the radical sign. In other words, don't do that.
Okay.
Not the same number. Okay?
Alrighty.
You got to keep the I. It's rarely, if ever, going to be inside the radical sign. Never seen a problem in high school algebra where you end up with square root of I.
Okay.
You just don't do it. So.
Yeah.
Okay. What else you got?
5x squared plus 33 equals 3.
Okay, these are all kind of similar. Next line.
Negative 30, or I mean 5x squared equals negative 30.
Next line.
Equals negative. divided by 5 on both sides, and then x squared equals 6,
Negative 6.
or negative 6, my bad, yeah.
Okay.
And then you have to find the square root of both numbers.
Okay.
So the next line would be x equals plus or minus the square root of 6, or negative 6. Yeah.
Remember what we're doing. We're just doing this. That's all we're doing. Taking the
Yeah.
square root of both sides. Now, let's look at negative 6, because that's a little bit of a confusing one. It's clearly negative 1 times square root of 6.
Mm-hmm.
Well, square root of 6 is the square root over here on the left. It's definitely the square root of 3 times the square root of 2, but neither of those numbers is a perfect square number. So I haven't really simplified it. So I don't simplify the square root of 6.
So you just leave it as that?
Just leave it as that. So my answer is going to be plus or minus square root of 6i.
Plus or minus the square root.
Yeah. In other words, I still have my plus or minus, but I can't really simplify the square root of 6 like I could the square root of 8. I can simplify the square root of 8, but I can't simplify the square root of 6 because it does not have a factor that's a perfect square number.
Okay.
Okay?
So the next one is, let me see.
Now, all of the ones we've done so far have been pretty much the same.
I'll find a different one.
Yeah, find a different one since we only have 7 minutes and I do have a 6:30 appointment that I got to get to. So I can't go over, but
all right.
So yeah, let's do a different type of problem. I think you get how to do those.
Yeah, I'm looking at my textbook right now. Sorry.
Sorry.
Number 12. Where's number 12? 12 should be different, but okay. This one's dealing with complex numbers. Is that
so are all the others. That's fine.
Oh. All right. It says
whenever you have I, that's a complex number.
Okay.
That's what complex numbers means.
Write the expression as a complex number in standard form. So 4i parentheses negative 6 plus I, and then close the parentheses.
Okay. So here we're multiplying.
All right.
Okay, and you're just going to distribute just like you would anything else. So for starters, that's minus 24i when I multiply that times that, plus 4i squared.
And that's standard form?
I squared, notice that I is the square root of negative 1. So I squared must be equal to negative 1. Mm-hmm. And whenever you run into an I squared, you want to substitute negative 1. So we have minus 24i plus 4 times negative 1. Well, what is that? That is minus 4 minus 24i. And they generally want it in what they call A plus BI format.
Okay.
Where A is the real part of the complex number, B is the coefficient of the imaginary part, but it's still a real number. Well, in our case, A is negative 4, B is negative 24.
All right.
But the key to this problem is converting the I squareds. So let's do another one if we're going to get an I square. Another one from that section is good to do.
Okay. Parentheses 9 minus 2i, and then close those. And then new parentheses, negative 4 plus 7i, and then it closes them.
Have you been taught FOIL?
It's been like I was taught it, but I didn't really I don't really understand how my teacher teaches right now.
Well, FOIL is
So,
basically every term by every term.
okay.
So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to multiply that term by that term. Then I'm going to multiply that term by that term. Then I'm going to multiply that term, which is minus 2i, times that term. And then I'm going to multiply that term by that term. In other words, every term by every term. What's our first term? 9 times minus 4.
That's negative 36.
What's the second term? It's 9 times 7i.
56?
63.
Oh, 63, man.
What's minus 2i times minus 4?
Negative 8i, or I mean positive 8i, sorry.
And finally, what's minus 2i times plus 7i?
14, negative 14i squared.
I squared. There's that I squared again. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, what we want to do is combine those like terms and convert that I squared to a negative 1. So what do we get? We get minus 36. Let's just do it step by step. Plus 71i, combining those two terms, and minus 14 times a minus 1. Well, that becomes plus 14. So if I add 14 to negative 36, I get negative 22 plus 71i. There's our answer, and again, it's in A plus BI format.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know, have they taught you this A plus BI format yet?
Yeah, I think she
It'll come into play when you start dividing. In other words, if I was dividing that, I'm going to get an answer that's not going to be in A plus BI format, and I'm going to have to separate it into two fractions. So that's why I asked, do you have any division problems involving complex numbers?
I might. I can look.
Unfortunately, I'm out of time, Britt. And
okay.
I have a 6:30, so I don't want to be late for it. And division is quite a bit. That's the only thing that's tough with complex numbers is division, because it's not really a division problem. What you're going to do is multiply the top by the conjugate of the bottom, and multiply the bottom by the conjugate of the bottom. In other words, I'm multiplying this by the number 1. And what that's going to do is turn the bottom into a real number. It's going to leave the top as a complex number, but that's okay. You can have a complex numerator, you just can't have a complex denominator.
Well, all right.
The rules of math say you cannot divide by an imaginary number. So you have to change the denominator, much in the same way that you can't divide by an irrational number. If I gave you an answer over here on the right, 1 divided by square root of 2, well, you can't give that answer because we're dividing by an irrational number. So you have to rationalize it, multiply the top and bottom by square root of 2, and you end up with square root of 2 over 2. That's an acceptable answer because it has a rational denominator. Same thing with imaginary numbers. You cannot have an imaginary denominator, and the way you get rid of it is to multiply by its conjugate. When I say conjugate, is all you do is change that sign. Everything else is the same.
All right. Well,
you will end up with a complex numerator, but that's okay. But the complex denominator will turn into a real number.
Oh, all right.
Okay. So, Britt, I will talk to you next time. Hope you enjoyed this online session.
I did. Thank you very much. It helped.
You're welcome. Okay, and I'll talk to you next time.
Yep. Adios, man.
Bye-bye.